This is the story of a man who died a year before the war, but whose tank became a symbol of the great victory. Mikhail Koshkin is a name that everyone interested in the history of World War II should know. The Kharkiv designer created the legendary 34, a machine that turned the tide of tank battles and largely determined the outcome of the war against fascism. But the creator of this masterpiece of tank building did not live to see his triumph, dying just a few months before it. The tragic fate of a brilliant engineer, the political intrigues surrounding his project, the technical revolution in tank building, and the price that had to be paid for creating the weapon of victory. Our story is about all this. Subscribe to our channel to learn more amazing stories from the past. What do you think? Could the course of the war have been different if Mikhail Koshkin had lived to see its beginning and continued to improve his tank? Share your opinion in the comments. In the remote Yaroslavl village of Brinchagi, lost among endless fields and dense forests, on December 21, 1908, a boy was born into the family of peasant Ilya Zakharovich Koshkin, a boy who was destined to change the course of world history. Mikhail Koshkin came into the world at a time when the Russian Empire was going through one of the most dramatic periods of its existence, and the harbingers of coming upheavals were already in the air. The Koshkin family was not wealthy, like most peasants in those distant years. The father, Ilya Zakharovich, was a hard-working and honest man, while his mother, Anna Alexeyevna, ran the household and raised the children. Their small hut, heated by a black stove, had neither electricity nor running water, but it was filled with an atmosphere of love and mutual understanding that shaped the character of the future genius engineer. Even in early childhood, Mikhail showed extraordinary curiosity and a penchant for technical creativity. While his peers played lapta or gorodki, little Misha took apart old watches, trying to understand how complex mechanisms worked. Neighbors were amazed to see a village boy sitting for hours over some broken thing, trying to fix it. This character trait, the desire to get to the bottom of things, to understand the principle of any mechanism, would remain with him for the rest of his life. When Mikhail turned 7, World War I began. Although the fighting took place far from the villages of Yaroslavl, the echoes of this terrible conflict reached Brinchag. Men were taken to the front, news of the dead came to the village, and the economy was falling apart. The Koshkin family, like many others, experienced serious difficulties. But it was during these difficult years that the boy developed an understanding of how important technology was for defending the motherland. Education in the village school was poor, but Mikhail literally absorbed every bit of knowledge his teachers gave him. He was particularly attracted to the exact sciences, mathematics and physics. Teachers noted that this thin boy with lively eyes had a rare ability to quickly grasp the essence of the most complex tasks and find original solutions. When the revolution broke out in Russia in 1917, Mikhail was only 9 years old, but he already understood that the old world was collapsing and something completely new was being built in its place. The revolutionary events radically changed life in the Russian countryside. Land reform, collectivization, industrialization, all these processes inevitably affected the fate of peasant children. But for Mikhail Koshkin, the revolution opened up unprecedented opportunities. The Soviet government proclaimed a policy of universal education and the training of new personnel from among the workers and peasants. A talented village boy was given a path to a greater life. By the end of the 1920s, it became clear that Mikhail had outgrown the confines of village life. His technical abilities, thirst for invention, and deep understanding of mechanisms required professional education. Despite financial difficulties, his family supported the young man's decision to go to school. It was not an easy decision to let their son go to the big city, knowing that he might never return to farm work. But who could have imagined then that this shy village boy would become the creator of a fighting machine that would change the course of the most terrible war in human history? It was here, in a small village in Yaroslavl, that the foundations were laid for the character of a man who, a few years later, would create the legendary T-34 tank, which became a symbol of victory over fascism. The year 1924 was a turning point in the life of 16-year-old Mikhail Koshkin. The Soviet Union was undergoing a period of new economic policy. The country was recovering from a devastating civil war, and the young state was in dire need of educated personnel. It was at this time that a talented young man from the Yaroslavl countryside found his way to technical education, which first took him to Leningrad and then determined his entire future. Enrolling in the Leningrad Polytechnic Institute was a real challenge for a country boy. The northern capital was impressive in its grandeur and scale. Wide avenues, majestic palaces, industrial enterprises, and, of course, famous educational institutions where personnel for the new industrial power were trained. Mikhail was struck not only by the beauty of the city, but also by the level of technical equipment at the institute. There were laboratories with modern equipment, libraries with thousands of technical books, and teachers who were recognized experts in their fields. The first months of study were not easy. The basic education of a country boy was significantly inferior to that of urban applicants, many of whom had studied in gymnasiums and had a much more solid knowledge base. But Koshkin possessed a quality that money cannot buy: tremendous work ethic and iron will. He literally lived in the Institute's lecture halls and libraries, studying not only the required curriculum, but also additional literature on mechanical engineering and metallurgy. The young student was particularly fascinated by lectures on the resistance of materials and theoretical mechanics. Professors noted that this shy young man with peasant roots possessed a rare engineering intuition, the ability to intuitively understand the behavior of mechanical systems under load. Koshkin did not simply memorize formulas and theorems. He sought to understand the physical meaning of each phenomenon and to imagine how a particular design would work in real conditions. By the end of his second year, Mikhail was already among the best students in his class. His course projects were distinguished not only by their technical competence, but also by the originality of their solutions. Teachers began to take notice of the young man's design abilities. He could look at a technical problem from a completely unexpected angle and find a solution that did not occur to more experienced engineers. But the real revelation for Koshkin came with lectures on automotive engineering and his first introduction to the principles of armored vehicle design. In the mid-1920s, tank building in the USSR was just beginning, and students were told about the first attempts to create combat vehicles in other countries. Mikhail listened with bated breath to stories about French Renault tanks, British tanks from World War I, and the technical solutions used by foreign designers. It was then that ideas began to form in the young engineer's mind, which a decade and a half later would be embodied in the metal of the legendary 34. Koshkin understood that a tank is not just an armored box with a gun, but a complex, technical system in which each element must work in absolute harmony with the others. The armor had to protect, but not make the machine too heavy. The engine had to provide high power, but be reliable and economical. The weapons had to destroy enemy equipment, but not overload the structure. In 1927, Mikhail Koshkin graduated with honors from the Leningrad Polytechnic Institute, with a degree in mechanical engineering. Various paths were open to the young specialist. He could have stayed in Leningrad, found a job at one of the large factories, and engaged in the design of civilian equipment. But fate had other plans. In those years, the Soviet Union was rapidly developing its defense industry, and the country needed talented designers to work in this strategically important field. Koshkin was offered a position at the Kharkiv locomotive plant, which was beginning to master the production of tanks in those years. What could have influenced the young engineer's decision more? The prospect of working on advanced technology, or the romance of creating weapons to defend the young Soviet Republic? Probably both factors together determined his choice. In the fall of 1927, the train carrying the young engineer Mikhail Koshkin arrived at the station in the Ukrainian city of Kharkov. This industrial center, which in those years was the capital of the Ukrainian Soviet Republic, became his second home and the place where his main life's work would unfold. The Kharkov locomotive plant, named after the Comintern, where the young specialist was headed, was one of the largest machine-building enterprises in the country, and it was here that the Soviet tank industry was to take shape. The plant was impressive in its scale. Huge workshops where hammers clanged and machines hummed, kilometers of railroad tracks along which blanks and finished products were transported, thousands of workers who every day created locomotives for the growing network of Soviet railways. But at the end of the 1920s, the enterprise began a gradual reorientation towards the production of a completely different product: armored combat vehicles. Koshkin joined the plant's design bureau at a very interesting time. The Soviet leadership realized the need to create its own tank industry, independent of foreign suppliers and technologies. The first Soviet tanks were modifications of foreign models, but even then, the task was set to develop original vehicles that would surpass their foreign counterparts in terms of key characteristics. The young engineer was initially assigned to a group working on the design of tank running gear. This field of engineering required in-depth knowledge of mechanics, materials, science, and vehicle dynamics. Koshkin immersed himself in studying the characteristics of tank propulsion systems, learning the intricacies of the operation of road wheels, tracks, torsion bars, and springs. He understood that a reliable running gear was the basis for the combat effectiveness of any vehicle. Working in the design bureau of the Kharkov plant opened up a whole new world for Koshkin. Talented engineers from different parts of the country gathered here, each bringing their own experience and knowledge. Senior colleagues shared the secrets of their craft, talked about the intricacies of tank building, and taught calculation and design methods. Mikhail eagerly absorbed every word, striving to understand the logic behind the technical decisions that were being made. Particularly important for Koshkin's development as a designer was his acquaintance with the work of the outstanding American tank designer John Christie. His revolutionary suspension, which allowed tanks to reach unprecedented speeds, made a huge impression on Soviet specialists. In 1930, the USSR acquired a license to produce Christie tanks, and on their basis, the creation of the famous series of high-speed BT tanks began. Working on the BT tanks became a real school of tank building for Koshkin. He participated in adapting the American design to Soviet production and operating conditions, studied the features of the layout of combat vehicles, and the principles of crew, ammunition, and unit placement. Each element of the design required careful analysis and optimization. Gradually, the young designer's authority grew. Colleagues noted his ability to find elegant technical solutions, his ability to see the problem as a whole and offer optimal solutions. Koshkin did not limit himself to completing the tasks assigned to him. He always sought to understand how to improve the design, make it more reliable, effective, and technologically advanced. By the mid-1930s, Mikhail Koshkin had already become one of the leading specialists at the Kharkiv Design Bureau. He was appointed deputy chief designer and was now responsible for coordinating work on various projects. This period became a time of accumulating invaluable experience that would allow him to create a masterpiece of tank building a few years later. But who could have guessed that very soon, this talented designer would lead the work on creating a machine that would determine the outcome of the most terrible war in human history. The Kharkiv years tempered Koshkin's character, shaped him as an engineer, and prepared him for the main challenge of his life. The 1930s went down in history as a period of tank fever that swept across all the world's leading industrial powers. The Soviet Union did not remain on the sidelines of this process. On the contrary, the country's leadership understood perfectly well that in the looming Great War, it was the armored forces that could become the decisive factor in victory. For Mikhail Koshkin, who worked at the Kharkiv Design Bureau, this was a period of intense creative growth and the formation of ideas that would later be embodied in the legendary T-34. World tank design in those years developed in several directions at once. The French relied on heavy, well-armored but slow vehicles designed to support the infantry. The Germans experimented with the concept of fast tanks, capable of breaking through enemy defenses and developing success in depth. The British tried to find a compromise between armor, armament, and mobility. Soviet designers carefully studied all these trends, striving to create their own school of tank building. At that time, heated discussions were taking place in Kharkiv about the direction of Soviet tank development. Some experts advocated the concept of light, fast vehicles capable of performing reconnaissance functions and operating deep behind enemy lines. Others insisted on the need to create heavy breakthrough tanks capable of overcoming powerful fortifications. Koshkin listened carefully to these debates, analyzed different points of view, and gradually formed his own vision of what the ideal tank should be. Practical experience with BT tanks, in the creation of which Mikhail was directly involved, revealed both the advantages and disadvantages of the high-speed vehicle concept. On the one hand, high speed did give tanks serious tactical advantages. They could quickly change positions, get out of firing range, and perform maneuvering operations. On the other hand, the pursuit of speed led to weaker armor and limitations in armament. Koshkin understood that the tank of the future should represent an optimal compromise between three basic characteristics: firepower, protection, and mobility. One parameter cannot be sacrificed for the sake of improving another. The tank had to be fast enough to perform maneuvering tasks, well protected enough to survive on the battlefield, and sufficiently armed to hit any target. The Kharkov designers paid particular attention to studying the experience of using tanks in local conflicts of those years. The Spanish Civil War, where modern tanks were used on a large scale for the first time, provided a lot of valuable information about the tactics of their use and the requirements for combat vehicles. Soviet T-26 and BT tanks proved themselves well, but also revealed a number of serious shortcomings. Analysis of combat use showed that existing Soviet tanks were not sufficiently protected against new anti-tank weapons. Their armament was not always capable of hitting well-protected targets, and the reliability of their components left much to be desired. These conclusions formed the basis for the technical requirements for promising armored vehicle designs, which began to be developed in the late 1930s. Koshkin was increasingly inclined to believe that a revolutionary breakthrough in tank construction was only possible with a radical rethinking of traditional approaches to design. It was necessary to find fundamentally new technical solutions that would allow the creation of a machine that significantly surpassed all existing models. And such solutions gradually took shape in his mind. Mikhail attached particular importance to the issue of armor. He understood that simply increasing the thickness of the armor would inevitably lead to an increase in the weight of the machine and a decrease in its mobility. It was necessary to find a way to increase the tank's protection without a critical increase in weight. This is where geometry came to the rescue. Rational angles of inclination of the armor plates could significantly increase their strength without increasing their thickness. But there were still many months of intense work, countless calculations, and experiments ahead before these ideas were embodied in the metal of the legendary 34. The tank fever of the 1930s paved the way for the birth of a masterpiece, but that triumph was still a long way off. By the end of the 1930s, the BT series tanks had become the backbone of the Soviet mechanized corps, and Mikhail Koshkin had a unique opportunity to observe their operation and analyze the strengths and weaknesses of these machines. The experience of working with Christie's high-speed tanks gave the Kharkov designers invaluable knowledge, which became the foundation for the creation of a fundamentally new combat vehicle. It was the analysis of the BT's legacy that allowed Koshkin to formulate the technical requirements that later formed the basis of the future T-34 project. The BT tanks, based on Walter Christie's American design, revolutionized Soviet tank building. Their main advantage was their unprecedented speed. These vehicles could reach speeds of up to 70 kilometers per hour on their wheels, making them the fastest tanks in the world. The revolutionary suspension with large road wheels provided excellent cross-country ability and a smooth ride even at high speeds. However, practical experience revealed serious design flaws. The armor protection of the BT tanks was clearly insufficient. The maximum armor thickness did not exceed 13 millimeters, which made the vehicles vulnerable even to large-caliber enemy machine guns. The vertical arrangement of the armor plates exacerbated the problem, reducing the effective resistance of the armor to shells. Koshkin carefully studied reports from firing ranges and exercises where BT tanks were tested. The results were disappointing. Even small-caliber anti-tank guns easily penetrated the armor of these vehicles. The designer understood that in a future war, this level of protection would be completely unacceptable. Tanks had to withstand hits from modern anti-tank weapons, otherwise they would become steel coffins for their crews. The armament of BT tanks also had its limitations. The 45mm gun of the 1932 model was quite effective against light enemy vehicles and infantry, but its capabilities against well-armored targets were limited. Koshkin understood that a promising tank must carry more powerful weapons capable of destroying any type of armored vehicle of a potential enemy. The designer was particularly concerned about the reliability of the BT tank's running gear. The complex wheel-track drive system required highly skilled mechanics and frequent maintenance. In practice, many crews preferred not to use the wheeled drive, fearing breakdowns of complex mechanisms. This negated one of the main advantages of Christie's design. Analyzing the experience of operating the BT, Koshkin came to the conclusion that the concept of a wheel-track drive had not proven itself. The complexity of the design was not offset by real combat advantages. A properly designed and manufactured tracked drive could provide sufficient speed, while being significantly more reliable and easier to maintain. But there was something about the BT tanks that made a deep impression on the designer: their excellent suspension. The system of large road wheels developed by Christie provided exceptional smoothness and allowed the tank to move at high speeds without losing stability. This idea stuck in Koshkin's mind, and he understood that elements of this suspension must be used in future designs. Mikhail also gave serious thought to the layout of BT tanks. The classic layout with the transmission located at the front had its advantages. It ensured good weight distribution and ease of maintenance. However, this layout required a long cardan shaft passing through the fighting compartment, which created additional problems and limited the internal volume of the tank. The experience gained from working with BT tanks allowed Koshkin to formulate the basic principles that he followed when designing the new tank. The vehicle had to retain the best qualities of fast tanks, high speed and excellent mobility, while also having much more powerful armor protection and armament. The design had to be as simple and reliable as possible, suitable for mass production and use in the army. By 1937, it had become clear that the BT tanks were becoming obsolete. Their capabilities no longer met the changing demands of the times and the new challenges that the Red Army might face. A fundamentally new machine was needed, one that incorporated all the best features of its predecessors, but was free of their shortcomings. It was then that Mikhail Koshkin began to develop the concept of a tank that was destined to change the course of history. The legacy of the BT was carefully analyzed, lessons were learned, and now it was time to create something completely new. A machine that would become a symbol of victory in the most terrible war in human history. In 1937, the Kharkiv Design Bureau was given a task that would determine the future of Soviet tank building. The main armored directorate of the Red Army issued technical specifications for the development of a new medium tank to replace the obsolete BT series. Mikhail Koshkin, who by that time was already the deputy chief designer of the plant, enthusiastically took on this work, not suspecting that he was creating a vehicle that was destined to become legendary. The technical specifications for the new tank, designated A-20, called for the creation of a versatile combat vehicle capable of performing a wide range of tasks on the battlefield. The new tank was required to have high speed, sufficient for maneuvering operations, reinforced armor capable of protecting the crew from modern anti-tank weapons, and powerful armament capable of destroying any type of enemy armored vehicle. Koshkin understood that creating such a vehicle would require revolutionary technical solutions. It was not enough to simply reinforce the armor and armament of existing tanks, as this would lead to a critical increase in weight and a decrease in mobility. A fundamentally new approach to design was needed, based on an optimal combination of all combat characteristics. Koshkin began sketching the first drafts of the future tank in the winter of 1937. He rejected the wheel-track drive used on BT tanks, opting for a simpler and more reliable pure-track design. This decision made it possible to simplify the design, increase its reliability, and free up additional space for thicker armor and more powerful weapons. The designer paid special attention to the layout of the vehicle. He proposed placing the engine in the rear of the tank, the transmission in the front, and the fighting compartment in the middle of the hull. This layout allowed for optimal weight distribution, improved crew visibility, and a more rational internal layout. The shape of the A-20 tank's hull was a revolutionary solution. Koshkin proposed abandoning the traditional vertical arrangement of armor plates in favor of an inclined one. The tank's frontal armor was given significant angles of inclination, which significantly increased its strength without increasing the thickness of the metal. This idea seemed so unusual that many of Koshkin's colleagues were initially skeptical. The A-20 tank was planned to be armed as powerfully as possible. Koshkin insisted on installing a 76mm F-22 gun, which significantly surpassed the firepower of the guns used on BT tanks. This gun could hit any type of armored vehicle in service with the Soviet Union's potential enemies. The suspension of the new tank was developed based on the best elements of the Christie system, but with significant improvements. Koshkin proposed using a torsion bar suspension, which provided excellent smoothness and was more compact and reliable than the spring system of BT tanks. Work on the A-20 project was carried out in strict secrecy. Koshkin and his team understood that they were creating a machine that could radically change the balance of power on the world stage. Every element of the design was worked out with the utmost care, and complex calculations were made regarding the strength, ballistics, and dynamics of the machine. Particular difficulties arose in the design of the tank turret. It had to accommodate a powerful gun with sufficient ammunition, provide the crew with good visibility, and at the same time have a rational shape that increased its resistance to shelling. Koshkin proposed an original solution, a streamlined turret with sloped armor plates, which became one of the most recognizable features of the future T-34. By the spring of 1938, the general appearance of the A-20 tank had been determined, and detailed work on all systems and assemblies began. Koshkin personally supervised each stage of the work, making adjustments to the design and optimizing various solutions. He understood that the quality of the design would determine not only the success of the new vehicle, but also the lives of thousands of tankers. In the summer of 1938, the A-20 project was submitted for consideration by the military leadership. The unusual appearance of the tank and its revolutionary technical solutions sparked heated discussions among military experts. Some admired the boldness of the design ideas, while others doubted the practical applicability of such radical innovations. But Mikhail Koshkin was confident that he had chosen the right path. He knew that he was creating not just a new tank, but a machine of the future that would determine the development of global tank building for many years to come. The A-20 project became the foundation on which the legendary 34 would soon be built. The presentation of the A-20 project to the military leadership marked the beginning of one of the most dramatic chapters in the history of Soviet tank building. Mikhail Koshkin's revolutionary ideas were met with conservatism from military circles and competition from other design bureaus. A real battle began over the concept of the future Soviet tank, with each side defending its own point of view on what a combat vehicle for the Red Army should be like. Koshkin's main opponents were the Leningrad designers, led by Semyon Ginzburg. They proposed an alternative tank design, the SMK Sergei Mironovich Kirov, which was a development of the traditional school of Soviet tank building. The SMK was a heavy vehicle with a multi-turret layout and powerful armor, but its mobility left much to be desired. The differences in approach were fundamental. Koshkin was betting on a versatile medium-weight vehicle capable of performing a wide range of combat tasks thanks to an optimal combination of firepower, protection, and mobility. The Leningraders preferred the concept of a heavy breakthrough tank designed to overcome powerful enemy fortifications. Disputes flared up at all levels, from technical meetings in design bureaus to meetings in the highest echelons of power. Each side presented convincing arguments in favor of its concept. Supporters of heavy tanks pointed to their superiority in armor protection and firepower. Defenders of Koshkin's ideas emphasized the advantages in maneuverability and cost-effectiveness of production. The sloped armor of the A-20 tank sparked particularly heated discussions. Many military engineers doubted the effectiveness of this solution, considering it a purely theoretical innovation. Koshkin had to prove the correctness of his calculations time and time again, explaining the physical principles underlying the increased strength of sloped armor. No less heated debates were held around the armament of the future tank. The military demanded the installation of the most powerful guns, not always taking into account their impact on the overall balance of the vehicle. Koshkin insisted that the armament should correspond to the overall concept of the tank and not disrupt the harmony of its combat characteristics. The situation was complicated by the fact that repression against the engineering and technical intelligentsia was gaining momentum in the country. Many talented designers were arrested, and an atmosphere of fear hung over all defense enterprises. In such conditions, any technical innovation could be interpreted as sabotage, and the failure of a project threatened the most serious consequences for its authors. Koshkin was well aware of the danger of the situation, but he did not waver in his convictions. He was prepared to risk his career and even his life for the sake of realizing ideas that he was absolutely certain were correct. He was supported by a team of like-minded people, talented engineers who shared his vision of the future of tank building. The turning point in the battle for the concept was the decision to create several experimental vehicles at once for comparative testing. In addition to the Kharkov A-20 and the Leningrad SMK, a third project was being prepared for testing: the Super Heavy KV Kliment Voroshilov tank, also created in Leningrad. This decision gave Koshkin a chance to prove the advantages of his concept in practice, but at the same time increased his responsibility. If the tests showed the A-20 project to be unviable, it could spell the end not only for the project itself, but also for the career of its creator. Preparation for the tests required the mobilization of all the resources of the Kharkov plant. Koshkin personally supervised every stage of the prototype's manufacture, not allowing the slightest deviation from the project. He understood that he had only one chance, and he could not afford to miss it. Particular attention was paid to those elements of the design that caused the most controversy. The sloped armor had to demonstrate its effectiveness, the new suspension had to show excellent smoothness, and the layout had to provide comfortable working conditions for the crew. By the fall of 1938, the first prototype of the A-20 tank was ready for testing. The decisive phase of the battle for the concept began, which would determine the direction of Soviet tank development and what kind of machine the Red Army would receive on the eve of the most terrible war in human history. In the spring of 1939, an event took place in the testing workshops of the Kharkov plant, the significance of which cannot be overestimated. The first prototype of the A-20 tank rolled off the assembly line. But at the same time, Kharkov designers led by Mikhail Koshkin created another vehicle, which was destined to go down in history under the index A-32. It was this second vehicle that became the direct predecessor of the legendary T-34. Although at that moment, few could have imagined what role it would play in world history. The creation of the A-32 tank was the result of Koshkin's foresight and his ability to anticipate the development of military technology. Analyzing trends in tank construction among the world's leading powers, the designer came to the conclusion that the 20mm armor protection specified in the technical specifications for the A-20 would soon become insufficient. Anti-tank artillery was developing rapidly, and new weapons could easily penetrate such armor. The decision to create a reinforced version of the tank was bold and risky. Koshkin was effectively working on two fronts: officially carrying out the state assignment on the A-20 project, and at the same time, at his own risk, developing a modification with reinforced armor. The thickness of the A-32's frontal armor was increased to 45 millimeters, which more than doubled the tank's protection. The increase in armor thickness required a redesign of the entire vehicle. The tank's weight increased, which required reinforcement of the running gear, transmission, and other components. Koshkin and his team did a tremendous job of optimizing the design, striving to maintain the vehicle's mobility at an acceptable level. Particular attention was paid to the power plant. The B-2 diesel engine, developed in Kharkov under the leadership of Konstantin Chelpan, was chosen for the A-32. This engine had a number of fundamental advantages over gasoline engines. It was more economical, less flammable, and had a longer service life. The use of diesel engines in tank construction was a revolutionary decision that was significantly ahead of the global level. Testing of the first A-20 and A-32 prototypes began in the summer of 1939. The superiority of the second machine became immediately apparent. The A-32 demonstrated an excellent combination of firepower, protection, and mobility. Its sloped armor proved highly resistant to various types of shells, and the diesel engine provided the machine with excellent dynamics and a long range. The Military Acceptance Committee carefully studied the test results. The advantages of the A-32 were so obvious that even skeptics were forced to admit that Koshkin was right. The tank surpassed all existing models in most combat characteristics while maintaining a reasonable production cost. The survivability of the vehicle made a particular impression. During field firing tests, the A-32 withstood hits from shells that easily penetrated the armor of other tanks. The sloped armor plates really did have the effect that Koshkin had hoped for. The shells ricocheted off the armor without causing serious damage to the vehicle. The new tank's mobility was no less impressive. The torsion bar suspension ensured excellent smoothness, even on rough terrain, and the powerful diesel engine allowed the vehicle to reach speeds of up to 55 kilometers per hour. In terms of mobility, the A-32 surpassed many light tanks, while remaining a well-protected and powerfully armed vehicle. The tank's armament also proved to be excellent. The 76mm L-11 gun could destroy any type of armored vehicle in service with potential enemies of the USSR. The ammunition load of 77 rounds provided the tank with high autonomy in battle. By the end of 1939, it became clear that the A-32 was superior to all alternative designs. The heavy multi-turret SMK and T-35 tanks proved ineffective. They were too complex, expensive, and unreliable. The future belonged to versatile medium-weight vehicles capable of performing a wide range of combat tasks. On December 19, 1939, the A-32 tank was adopted by the Red Army under the Index T-34. Thus ended the birth of the legendary machine that was to become a symbol of victory in the Great Patriotic War. Mikhail Koshkin could be proud of his brainchild. He had created a tank that would determine the development of world tank building for many years to come. The adoption of the A-32 tank under the Index T-34 was only the first step in the long journey to create the perfect combat vehicle. Mikhail Koshkin understood perfectly well that between the prototype and the production tank lay a huge amount of work to refine the design, eliminate identified shortcomings, and prepare for production. The winter and spring of 1940 were a time of intensive testing, during which the future T-34 had to prove its outstanding characteristics. The first serious tests of the new tanks began in January 1940 at the test sites near Kharkiv. The severe frosts became a real test for all the vehicle's systems. Despite its advantages, the V2 diesel engine proved to be very temperamental in cold weather. Starting the engine at temperatures below -20 degrees Celsius required special procedures and additional equipment. Koshkin personally attended all the tests, carefully recording every flaw that was identified. His notebook was filled with dozens of notes, ranging from serious design problems to minor inconveniences that could complicate the crew's work. Each note required analysis and a search for the optimal solution. Particular problems arose with the tank's transmission. The gearbox, designed for the lighter A-20 vehicle, struggled to cope with the increased weight of the A-32. Shifting gears required considerable effort from the driver mechanic, and during intensive operation, there were cases of gear teeth breaking. Equally serious concerns were raised about the engine cooling system. The powerful V2 generated a lot of heat, and the existing radiators were not always able to dissipate it, especially when driving in low gears or during prolonged stationary operation. The entire cooling system required significant redesign. Weapons testing also revealed a number of problems. The 76mm L11 cannon showed good ballistic characteristics, but its guidance mechanisms were not accurate enough. Aimed fire at long ranges was difficult due to backlash in the turret and gun drives. Koshkin understood that all these problems had to be solved before mass production could begin. He organized round-the-clock work at the Design Bureau and brought in the plant's best specialists to refine the tank. Each unit and assembly was carefully analyzed and modernized. Work to eliminate the shortcomings was carried out in all areas simultaneously. Engine designers refined the V2's cold-weather starting system. Transmission specialists reinforced the gearbox, and armament specialists improved the gun's aiming mechanisms. Each design change required new tests and checks. Work on the cooling system was particularly intense. Koshkin personally participated in the search for the optimal configuration of radiators, testing various options for fans and air ducts. The solution was found in the installation of additional radiator sections and the modernization of the forced cooling system. By the spring of 1940, most of the identified problems had been eliminated. The upgraded T-34 tank showed significantly improved reliability and combat effectiveness. The engine started at lower temperatures, the transmission gained the necessary strength reserve, and the cooling system ensured stable operation in all conditions. In parallel with the technical improvements, preparations were underway for serial production. Koshkin took an active part in the development of technological processes and supervised the manufacture of special equipment and tools. He understood that the success of the tank would depend not only on the perfection of its design, but also on the quality of mass production. Spring tests in 1940 showed that the T-34 was ready for serial production. The tank demonstrated excellent combat characteristics. The reliability of its systems had increased significantly, and the identified shortcomings had been eliminated. Mikhail Koshkin could state with satisfaction that his brainchild had passed all the tests and was ready to defend the motherland. But another test awaited the tank, the famous run to Moscow, which was supposed to finally demonstrate the capabilities of the new machine and convince the country's top military and political leadership of the correctness of the chosen path of tank development. March 1940 will go down in the history of Soviet tank building as the time of the legendary run of 2 T-34 tanks from Kharkiv to Moscow. This epic journey, undertaken on the initiative of Mikhail Koshkin, became not only a demonstration of the outstanding performance of the new vehicle, but also the last great feat of the brilliant designer. It was during this journey that Koshkin caught a cold, which subsequently led to his untimely death. But in return, the Soviet leadership received irrefutable proof of the T-34's superiority over all existing models of armored vehicles. Koshkin came up with the idea of a run to Moscow because of the need to demonstrate the new tank to the country's top military and political leadership. Tests at the proving grounds showed the vehicle's excellent characteristics, but military officials demanded additional proof of the new tank's reliability and practicality. Koshkin decided that the best way to demonstrate this would be a forced march of more than 700 kilometers. Preparing for the run required careful planning. It was necessary to determine the route, organize the supply of fuel and spare parts, and obtain permits from the relevant authorities. Koshkin personally dealt with all these issues, understanding that the success of the entire enterprise would depend on the quality of the preparation. A particular difficulty was the need for secrecy. The new tanks were not to reveal their characteristics, so the movement was planned mainly at night on sparsely populated roads. The crews were given strict instructions not to disclose any information about the vehicles or their purpose. On March 5, 1940, two T-34 tanks, numbered 1 and 2, left the Kharkiv factory and set off for Moscow. The crews were led by experienced testers Nikolai Nosik and Vasily Dyukhanov, who had extensive experience working with new equipment. Mikhail Koshkin followed the tanks in an escort vehicle, ready to provide technical assistance at any moment. The first few kilometers of the journey showed that all fears were unfounded. The tanks moved confidently, their engines ran smoothly, and the running gear demonstrated excellent smoothness. The torsion bar suspension, which had caused so much controversy during the design stage, proved itself from the best side. Even on broken country roads, the tanks ran smoothly and quietly. The fuel efficiency of the diesel engines was particularly impressive. Fuel consumption was significantly lower than estimated, which made it possible to increase daily travel distances and reduce travel time. The V2 performed reliably even at the low temperatures that still prevailed in early March. There were also some adventures. On the approach to Belgorod, one of the tank's starters failed, and the vehicle had to be started by pushing. On the roads near Tula, which had been softened by the spring thaw, the tanks got stuck in the mud and needed the help of tractors to free them. Each such case was carefully analyzed by Koshkin for consideration in further work. The most dramatic part was crossing the Oka River. The bridge in Serpukhov wasn't designed for such a load, so the tanks had to be transported across the ice. In some places, the ice bent under the weight of the vehicles, but it held. This episode demonstrated not only the courage of the crews, but also a sensible engineering solution. The weight of the T-34 was optimally selected to overcome natural obstacles. On March 17th, the tanks arrived in Moscow and were delivered to the Kremlin for demonstration to the top leadership. Joseph Stalin personally inspected the new vehicles and was pleased with what he saw. He was particularly impressed by the sloped armor of the tanks. He studied the shape of the hull and turret for a long time and asked about the principles of increasing shell resistance. Kliment Voroshilov, the People's Commissar of Defense, was amazed by the tank's performance. The vehicles covered more than 700 kilometers with virtually no breakdowns, which testified to the high reliability of the design. The decision to launch mass production of the T-34 was made immediately. But for Koshkin himself, the Moscow test drive proved fatal. During night marches in the cold March weather, he caught a severe cold. Doctors diagnosed pneumonia, which progressed rapidly under the conditions of intense work. The brilliant designer paid for the triumph of his brainchild with his own health, not knowing that he had only a few months left to live. The triumphant completion of the Moscow run did not mean the end of the struggle for the fate of the T-34 tank. On the contrary, the success of the new machine attracted the close attention not only of military specialists, but also of representatives of the party nomenclature, for whom issues of defense capability often became a tool in political games. Mikhail Koshkin, weakened by illness, was forced to wage a difficult struggle not only with technical problems, but also with the intrigues that were brewing in the highest echelons of Soviet power around his brainchild. Koshkin's main opponent in this struggle was Marshal Grigory Kulik, Deputy People's Commissar of Defense for Armaments. This influential military leader, who had direct access to Stalin, categorically rejected the concept of a medium tank. Kulik was a proponent of developing light and heavy vehicles, considering medium tanks to be an unnecessary compromise that could not effectively solve any of the specialized tasks. Kulik's position was not without a certain logic from the point of view of traditional military doctrine. Light tanks were supposed to perform reconnaissance functions and support the infantry, while heavy tanks were supposed to break through the enemy's fortified defenses. Why were medium tanks needed, which were inferior to light tanks in speed and cost, and to heavy tanks in armor protection and firepower? Koshkin understood the fallacy of this approach, but it was extremely difficult to explain this to the marshal. Kulik had no technical education and judged tanks from the perspective of a cavalry officer, which he had been during the Civil War. For him, a tank was simply a more perfect replacement for a horse, and the intricacies of ballistics, metallurgy, and mechanical engineering remained a mystery. The situation was complicated by the fact that repression against engineering and technical personnel continued in the country. Many talented designers had already been arrested, and those who remained free lived in constant fear. In such an atmosphere, any technical innovation could be interpreted as sabotage, and the failure of a project as undermining the country's defense capabilities. Particularly dangerous for Koshkin was the fact that he had created the A-32 tank without any official assignment, exceeding his authority. Under Stalin's regime, such initiative could be regarded as a gross violation of discipline and lead to the most serious consequences. Only the outstanding characteristics of the machine saved the designer from repression. Kulik did not limit himself to criticizing the T-34 concept. He actively promoted alternative projects. The marshal gave particular support to the development of KV heavy tanks, seeing in them the future of Soviet tank building. Leningrad designers received preferential treatment in terms of funding and material support, while their Kharkov counterparts experienced constant difficulties. The confrontation reached its peak in the spring of 1940, when Kulik attempted to halt work on the T-34. He argued that the army did not need a medium tank and that resources should be directed toward the development of more promising projects. Only the personal intervention of Stalin, who was impressed by the Moscow demonstration, prevented a catastrophe. The struggle was waged not only at the highest political level, but also in professional circles. Many military engineers, trained in traditional approaches to tank building, were skeptical of Koshkin's revolutionary ideas. Sloped armor, a diesel engine, a new layout. All these innovations were met with skepticism by conservative-minded specialists. Koshkin was forced to expend enormous effort to explain the advantages of his concept. He spoke at numerous meetings, wrote memos, and consulted with the military. Each speech became more difficult for him. His illness progressed, and his strength left his body. Criticism from colleagues at other design bureaus was particularly painful for the designer. Leningrad tank builders openly called the T-34 Kharkov amateurism, claiming that only their heavy tanks could ensure victory in a future war. Moscow designers were also slow to recognize the superiority of the Kharkov machine. Nevertheless, the situation gradually began to change in Koshkin's favor. The test results were too convincing to be ignored. Military experts who worked directly with the new tank unanimously noted its outstanding qualities. Even among the project's opponents, doubts began to arise about the correctness of their position. The international situation played a decisive role in the fate of the T-34. The war that had begun in Europe demonstrated the growing role of tank units in modern combat. German panzer divisions won one victory after another, demonstrating the advantages of the massive use of armored vehicles. The Soviet Union urgently needed modern tanks capable of countering German technology. In the summer of 1940, a final decision was made to launch mass production of the T-34. Political games gave way to the looming military threat. Koshkin could note with satisfaction the victory of his ideas. But this victory came at too high a price. The spring of 1940 was a time of great triumph and tragic end for Mikhail Koshkin. His brainchild, the T-34 tank, received official recognition and went into mass production. But the creator of the legendary machine was slowly fading away, struck down by an illness he had contracted during the Moscow run. The price of success proved too high. The brilliant designer paid for the realization of his dream with his own life. Koshkin's illness progressed rapidly. What at first seemed like a common cold, contracted during nighttime trips in the cold March air, quickly developed into severe pneumonia. Doctors insisted on hospitalization and long-term treatment, but the designer categorically refused to leave his workplace. He understood that his presence was critical to the successful introduction of the T-34 into serial production. The Kharkov plant was undergoing a period of radical reorganization of production. The development of a fundamentally new tank required the restructuring of technological processes, the creation of new equipment, and the retraining of workers. Koshkin personally supervised every stage of this extremely complex work, not trusting such an important matter to anyone else. Particular difficulties arose with the development of the production of hulls with sloped armor. Traditional welding methods were not suitable for joining armor plates located at complex angles. New technologies, special equipment, and highly skilled welders were required. Koshkin spent hours in the workshops, striving to achieve perfect weld quality. No less difficult was the task of setting up production of the V2 diesel engines. These engines differed significantly from traditional gasoline engines and required special precision in manufacturing. The slightest deviation from technical requirements led to a decrease in reliability and service life. Koshkin literally lived at the factory, controlling the quality of every detail. The designer's health was causing increasing concern among those around him. He had lost a lot of weight, coughed frequently, and experienced shortness of breath at the slightest physical exertion. His colleagues begged him to take a vacation and seek treatment, but Koshkin was adamant. He said that there was no time for illness. War could break out at any moment, and the army needed new tanks. Work on improving the design of the T-34 continued unabated. The first production vehicles revealed a number of shortcomings that needed to be addressed. Koshkin personally analyzed each comment from the operators and developed technical solutions to improve the design. His notebooks were filled with new ideas and suggestions. Criticism of the tank's armament was particularly painful for Koshkin. The 76mm L-11 gun, which seemed powerful enough in 1939, by the middle of the 1940s, no longer fully met the increased requirements. German armored vehicles were becoming increasingly well protected, and a more powerful weapon was needed. The designer understood the need to modernize the armament, but at the same time feared that changes in the turret design could delay production. Every day of delay meant that the army would not receive dozens of new tanks. As a result, it was decided to start serial production with the existing armament and, at the same time, develop an improved version. In the summer of 1940, the first mass-produced T-34s began to arrive in the troops. For Koshkin, this was a moment of great satisfaction. His brainchild had finally begun to defend the motherland. But his joy was overshadowed by a progressive illness that increasingly undermined the designer's strength. Doctors diagnosed Koshkin with pulmonary tuberculosis, a deadly disease at the time. Treatment required complete rest, sanatorium conditions, and long-term therapy. But the designer continued to work, realizing that every day could be his last when he was still able to contribute to his brainchild. In August, Koshkin's condition deteriorated sharply. He was no longer able to move around the factory on his own, but he continued to receive visitors in his office, discuss technical issues, and give instructions to his subordinates. His colleagues watched with horror as this talented man, who had devoted all his energy to serving his country, faded away. On September 26, 1940, Mikhail Koshkin's heart stopped beating forever. He was only 32 years old, but in his short life he managed to create a machine that changed the course of world history. The creator of the T-34 did not live to see the start of the Great Patriotic War. Dying just 9 months before it began, he did not see his tanks destroy Nazi equipment and bring victory closer. Koshkin's death was a huge loss for Soviet tank building, but his work was continued by his students and colleagues. The T-34 continued to be improved, was produced in millions, and became a symbol of victory over fascism. The price of success was unimaginable, the life of a brilliant designer, but this success saved millions of other lives and ensured victory in the most terrible war in human history. Mikhail Koshkin's death was a heavy blow to the Kharkiv tank builders, but life demanded that the work he had begun be continued. The Great Patriotic War was just around the corner, and the country desperately needed new tanks. The students and colleagues of the brilliant designer took on the responsibility of developing his legacy, understanding that the fate of their homeland depended on their work. The main heir to Koshkin's work was his deputy, Alexander Morozov, who had to not only continue improving the T-34, but also create new generations of Soviet tanks. Alexander Alexandrovich Morozov was one of Koshkin's closest associates and was directly involved in the creation of the T-34 from the earliest stages of the project. This talented engineer possessed not only deep technical knowledge, but also the organizational skills necessary to lead a large design team. His appointment as chief designer was a logical continuation of the work begun by Koshkin. The first task facing the new head of the design bureau was to eliminate the shortcomings identified during the operation of the first production T-34s. Tank crews complained about the cramped fighting compartment, the inconvenience of operating the radio station, and the poor visibility from the vehicle. Each comment required careful analysis and a search for technical solutions. Morozov paid particular attention to improving the tank's armament. The experience of the first months of the war showed that the 76mm L-11 gun, although quite effective, did not have the necessary power reserve to combat advanced German equipment. A more powerful weapon was needed, capable of destroying any type of enemy tank. The solution was found in installing the 76mm F-34 gun, developed by Vasily Grabina's design bureau, on the T-34. This gun had significantly better ballistic characteristics and could effectively destroy German armored vehicles at all combat ranges. The modernization required serious modifications to the turret, but the result was worth the effort. Morozov understood that the war would require not only the improvement of existing vehicles, but also the creation of fundamentally new models. As early as 1941, his design bureau began work on a promising medium tank that was to surpass the T-34 in all key characteristics. This project, which later received the index T-44, was a further development of Koshkin's ideas. An equally important task was to establish mass production of tanks in wartime conditions. The evacuation of factories to the deep rear, the shortage of skilled personnel, and the shortage of materials all created enormous difficulties for the tank industry. Morozov had to not only supervise the design work, but also solve production problems. Nikolai Kucherenko, who headed the development of heavy tanks, played a special role in continuing Koshkin's work. This talented designer applied the principles laid down in the T-34 to the creation of powerful breakthrough machines. This led to the creation of the IS tanks, which became a worthy addition to the medium tanks in the Soviet armored vehicle lineup. The team of Kharkov designers remained faithful to the basic principles of Koshkin's school: rational armor angles, an optimal combination of firepower, protection, and mobility, simplicity, and technological efficiency of design. All these ideas were further developed in post-war projects. The memory of Mikhail Koshkin was carefully preserved by the factory staff. His office remained untouched for a long time, and a portrait of the creator of the T-34 occupied a place of honor in the factory museum. New generations of designers studied Koshkin's work, striving to understand the logic of his technical solutions and apply it in their own projects. The war became a severe test of Koshkin's legacy. The T-34 proved to be a formidable opponent for German tanks, but it also revealed a number of shortcomings that needed to be addressed. Morozov and his team worked continuously to improve the vehicle, taking into account the experience of combat use. work to increase crew survivability became particularly important. Analysis of destroyed tanks showed that many losses could have been avoided with more rational placement of ammunition and fuel. Designers developed a number of measures to improve fire safety and reduce the likelihood of ammunition detonation. By the end of the war, it was clear that Koshkin's successors had honorably fulfilled their mission. The T-34 became not only the most mass-produced tank of World War II, but also a model for designers around the world to emulate. The principles underlying its design determined the development of tank building for many decades to come. Morozov continued to develop his teacher's ideas after the war. The T-44, T-54, and T-55 tanks became the direct successors of the T-34, and for many years formed the basis of the armored forces not only of the Soviet Union, but also of many other countries. Mikhail Koshkin's work lived on and developed, contributing to the cause of peace and security. On June 22, 1941, the Great Patriotic War began, and the T-34 tanks, created by the genius of Mikhail Koshkin, first encountered German armored vehicles in battle. That day became a real test for the brainchild of the Kharkiv designer, proving how correct his technical solutions and design ideas were. The first battles showed that Koshkin was right. His tank really was better than anything the Germans had at the start of the war. But the T-34 could only reach its full potential after Soviet tankers figured out how to use it. By the start of the war, there were about 1,000 T-34 tanks in the western military districts, but most of them had not yet been fully mastered by the crews. The new vehicle was radically different from the light BT and T-26 tanks that Soviet tankers had previously served on. The diesel engine, mechanical transmission, and new control and observation devices required serious retraining of personnel. The first clashes with German tanks occurred in the early hours of the war. T-34s from the 6th Mechanized Corps encountered German PZKPFW-3 and PZKPFW-4 tanks in the Grodno area and demonstrated their complete superiority. The shells of German tanks could not penetrate the sloped armor of Soviet vehicles, while the 76mm guns of the T-34 easily destroyed German equipment. German tankers were shocked by the appearance of a Soviet tank previously unknown to them. The reports of the commanders of the panzer divisions were full of phrases about invulnerable Russian monsters that could not be destroyed with standard anti-tank guns. General Heinz Guderian, commander of the 2nd Panzer Group, wrote in his memoirs that the appearance of the T-34 came as a complete surprise to the German command. However, the first months of the war showed that even the most perfect tank cannot compensate for shortcomings in tactics and crew training. Many T-34s were lost due to inept use, breakdowns that could have been avoided with proper maintenance, and simple ignorance of the machine's capabilities. The operation of radio stations became a particularly painful problem. Most of the first series of T-34s did not have radio communication, which made it impossible to coordinate the use of tank units. Commanders were forced to control the battle with flags and light signals, which was extremely ineffective under intense enemy fire. Serious problems also arose with the maintenance of the new vehicles. Regimental repairmen, accustomed to simple and unpretentious BT tanks, had difficulty mastering the peculiarities of servicing the T-34's diesel engines and complex transmission. Many tanks broke down for technical reasons that could have been easily prevented with proper maintenance. Nevertheless, the combat qualities of the vehicle, laid down by Koshkin, gradually became more and more apparent. Tank crews who mastered the new technology achieved outstanding success. The T-34 proved capable of performing a wide variety of combat tasks, from reconnaissance to breaking through fortified enemy defenses. The sloped armor plates of the hull and turret proved to be particularly effective. Even when hit by large-caliber shells, they often ricocheted, saving the lives of the crews. The Germans were forced to urgently develop new anti-tank weapons capable of destroying the T-34. The tank's powerful armament allowed it to successfully combat not only armored vehicles, but also enemy fortifications. The 76mm F-34 gun could destroy pillboxes and dugouts, hit artillery positions, and destroy enemy manpower. The versatility of the T-34 made it indispensable in maneuver warfare. The high mobility of the vehicle, provided by a powerful diesel engine and a reliable chassis, allowed tanks to make deep raids into enemy rear areas, quickly change positions, and avoid artillery fire. The T-34's range significantly exceeded that of German tanks. By the end of 1941, it became clear that the T-34 had radically changed the nature of tank battles. The Germans were forced to hastily modernize their equipment and create new models of tanks and anti-tank guns. Tank warfare took on a completely different character. The winter campaign of 1941 to 1942 was a triumph for the T-34. While German equipment froze in the Russian cold, Soviet tanks with diesel engines remained combat-ready even at the lowest temperatures. The counteroffensive near Moscow demonstrated the full power of the T-34. Mikhail Koshkin's tank proved its effectiveness in the most difficult conditions. The machine, created by the talent of one man, became a formidable weapon in the hands of Soviet soldiers and made a decisive contribution to the victory over Nazi Germany. The Great Patriotic War became the true apotheosis of Mikhail Koshkin's creation. The T-34 tank, born in the quiet of the Kharkiv design bureaus, became a symbol of the Soviet people's unyielding will to victory and was one of the decisive factors in the defeat of Nazi Germany. Over the 4 years of the war, more than 84,000 of these machines were produced, and each one carried a piece of its creator's genius, proving the correctness of his technical solutions and the foresight of his design ideas. The history of the T-34 during the war is a story of constant improvement and adaptation to changing combat conditions. Koshkin's successors did not simply reproduce his creation. They developed the ideas embedded in it and brought the design to perfection. Modifications appeared with improved armament, reinforced armor, and modernized components. But the basics stayed the same: sloped armor, a diesel engine, and a smart layout. The Battle of Stalingrad showed off the T-34 in all its glory. In street fighting, where every building was a fortress, Koshkin's tanks proved how versatile they were. They could fight enemy tanks at long ranges, storm fortifications, and support infantry in close combat. German generals were forced to admit that without creating an equivalent counterweight to the T-34, victory in the war would be impossible. The Battle of Kursk was the climax of the tank confrontation. Here, the T-34 faced the latest German vehicles, the Tigers and Panthers, designed specifically to combat Soviet tanks. Despite the enemy's technical superiority in certain characteristics, the mass use and tactical competence of Soviet tankers ensured victory. The T-34's technological sophistication, a quality that Koshkin had originally incorporated into its design, played a special role in its success. Unlike the complex and capricious German machines, the 34 was adapted for mass production in wartime conditions. This allowed the USSR to produce tanks in quantities unattainable for the enemy. The ease of maintenance and repair that Koshkin built into the design ensured the high combat readiness of the tank units. The T-34 could be repaired in the field using the simplest tools and materials at hand. Many vehicles that seemed hopelessly damaged were returned to service thanks to the heroism of the repairmen and the well-thought-out design. The diesel engine, for which Koshkin was once criticized, proved its outstanding qualities: economy, reliability, and fire safety. All these characteristics of the V2 proved to be critically important in wartime conditions. The tanks could operate at great distances from supply bases, and the probability of catching fire when hit was significantly lower than that of vehicles with gasoline engines. The sloped armor of the T-34 not only provided protection for the crew, but also became the benchmark for tank builders around the world. After the war, virtually all new tanks were designed with the principles first implemented by Koshkin in mind. Rational angles of inclination for armor plates became a mandatory feature of any modern combat vehicle. The influence of the T-34 on the development of global tank manufacturing cannot be overestimated. German designers were forced to radically revise their approaches to tank design. The appearance of the Panther was a direct response to the challenge posed by the Soviet machine. But time had been lost, and technical superiority could no longer compensate for industrial backwardness. After the war, the T-34 continued to serve in many armies around the world. The tanks were supplied to socialist countries, participated in local conflicts, and protected peace on all continents. Koshkin's machine became a symbol of the people's struggle for liberation against imperialism and colonialism. The technical legacy of the creator of the T-34 continued to live and develop in post-war Soviet tanks. The T-44, T-54, T-55, and T-62 all embodied Koshkin's ideas, developed and refined by his students. The Soviet Tank School, founded by the brilliant designer, determined the development of world tank building for many decades. The memory of Mikhail Koshkin is immortalized not only in the metal of his tanks. Streets, factories, and educational institutions bear his name. A monument to the creator of the legendary machine has been erected in Kharkiv. But the main monument to the genius designer remains the T-34 itself, the tank that changed the course of history. Today, more than 80 years after the creation of the first T-34, we can say with complete confidence that Mikhail Koshkin has achieved true immortality. His name is forever associated with one of the greatest victories of the human mind over the forces of evil. A village boy from the Yaroslavl countryside created a weapon that saved the world from the fascist plague and ensured a bright future for all of humanity.